Thank you for three wonderful, insightful speech. Hello, Anna. Hello, Heidi. Hello, Laura. It seems that the technology is not always convenient and it's not always pleasing. I know it's too early for Anna and Heidi, right? And it's too late for Laura, right? So let's focus on our 30 minutes discussion. Before I hand over to the audience on site, I wish to just discuss briefly about the three speeches. Actually, that's the three speeches included in this session all covers on the practical aspect of repatriation. I think that they have talked about how to transfer art, artifacts, heritage between the source and the market. They cover the difference. I think that's a different level of repatriation. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, but that's the real situation we encountered nowadays. Sometimes we divide the repatriation into different levels. Sometimes we refer to the physical repatriation, the physical return, and sometimes we talk about the intellectual return. Certainly, I'm quite uncertain about the division. Just as Lai Shun just asked hours ago, how can we tell the difference between the physical and intellectual of the same objects, the same art? So that's the three speakers has talked some successful stories of repatriation. Actually, my first question is that, is there any specific reason or any particular situation to help your story or your experience successful? So can we learn generally from your story, or your success is fully based on any unique or particular reason?
Yeah, I can start at both. For us, it was incredibly important to have the funding that we received. With the funding, we were able to hire our team full-time. And so the international collaboration that we brought together was successful because of that funding. And so I really want to stress that digital heritage projects and international collaborations that we have heard about so much in the seminar need the proper funding to be successful.
I can go next. I wasn't involved, I want to just make that clear, with the repatriation of the Ghost Institute to the United States, to the Lakota tribe. But from my observation of the case study, I think one of the most important elements of that case was the ability for all of the parties involved to listen to one another. I think that was a critical element, that the museum was listening to the Lakota tribe about how important that object was to them and how necessary and vital it was to have that returned. The museum listened to their visitors who, the vast majority wanted to see that return of the shirt happen. And the museum, again, listened to the Lakota tribe in terms of how that object should be displayed, how the reproduction should be displayed in the museum after the return had happened, and being able to highlight the story of that return from the voice of the Lakota tribe member who created the reproduction. So from my outside observer perspective, I think the most important part of that story to make it successful was listening.
I can come in too. Can you hear me? Hi. So I think what I've been watching, and we're still in the middle of our return, it hasn't happened yet, but I've been paying really close attention to the impact, I think, following what Anne was talking about, of the really top-down support for repatriation or restitution. And I mean, I think what you see in the UK is just the very beginning of a journey of national recognition of restitution as a strategy for coping with colonial histories. And I think you can see in the US context and in Germany, for example, a greater national acknowledgement or commitment to that form of redress. And the National Trust is a membership organisation. It's not a national, even though it has the word national in it, it's not run, it's a non-governmental organisation. It's, you know, one of the largest subscription membership organisations. Essentially, it's private. It's run by its trustees on behalf of the members as a charity. And what you see in the UK is almost all of the repatriation initiatives have been spearheaded by smaller non-governmental institutions. So I think there is something really crucial about being mindful of the differences that you can achieve when you do have that top-down national level of support, and that filters through into law and the kind of national consciousness in a very different way to the grassroots bottom-up perspectives that I think we're currently seeing in the UK.
Okay, thank you. The second observation from my point of view is that I noticed that Haiti, just from the perspective of academic discipline, Haiti and Laura comes from anthropology and ethnography. But Anna comes from history or archaeology. So my question is that in anthropology and ethnography, using replica is acceptable for any person who will receive the copy. But is that applicable for the case in archaeology? So, for example, in Benin, we have the digital form, and so actually the question is that who will maintain, who will own the material form of the art, of the artifacts? So that's the experience in anthropology and ethnography can be borrowed or can be learned in the field of history and archaeology. So that's my second question.
I could come in there if that's okay. I mean, I think what I've learned as an anthropologist is that the binary between the original and the copy is not the same everywhere. And actually working a lot in the Pacific archipelago of Vanuatu, which is where I've done most of my field work, but also working in museums with photography as a particular kind of object. I've had a lot of experience becoming aware that actually objects that can be reproduced and circulated and therefore exist in many different places at the same time may be equally as authentic as indexes of cultural knowledge and practice. And that this preoccupation with the original comes from a very particular historical context, and this idea of authenticity and the aura of the original, which actually Walter Benjamin wasn't that invested in. He was really invested in this idea of film and photography as being kind of political tools to overcome that binary and disseminate culture much more broadly through the masses. So I think we have to be quite careful of whose value system we are supporting when we kind of bed in with this opposition between the replica and the original. But I also want to just highlight that, there's been really interesting pushback around this idea of digital repatriation from cultural communities who kind of sometimes say, well, fine, you want to give us digital objects, but you refuse to let go of the originals. And we're left holding a kind of actually very unsustainable digital architecture of digital media is very, very short-lived and requires technical expertise and continual upgrading because of the built-in obsolescence. And actually giving digital objects then isn't the same as giving back the real things. So there is a kind of parallel conversation that does bed in those distinctions as well. But it's much, much more complicated than a simple either-or.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. Benjamin was a Marxist, and he arguably, I don't know what he would have thought of reproductions in the context of how we're talking about them, but the part of the argument that museums really like to cling to is the aura part, but he thought that the more reproductions that you made of an object, the further that you moved away from that original aura of a work of art, and that you could then have enough distance to ask like political questions about that object, right? So anyway, tangent. I actually come from the academic discipline of, I'm an educator. I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist or an ethnographer. So for me, this issue of reproductions and copies, as someone who studies museums have heaps of copies already in their midst. We just aren't very public about it. Like if you go to a natural science museum or a science museum, most of those dinosaur skeletons that we see are really just reproductions of dinosaur bones. And I liked what you were saying about, is it a learned behavior to accept reproductions? And, in the 1800s, museums used to have, like, casts of sculptures were all the rage, and they were not seen as being worse than the original. Like, there were cast exchanges and, like, cast societies back in the day. So, like I talked about in my presentation, we've really moved away from that, like with the advent of photography and with the copyright law going into effect in Great Britain. It kind of started this just insistence on originality that, like Haiti was saying, it's something that I think we really need to ask questions about in our contemporary society.
Yeah, this question about reproduction, I think, should not be answered from a Eurocentric or US American perspective. And I heard that, it was argued very much from the perspective of art museums in Europe and the United States, with authors, very much embedded in the tradition of continental philosophy and STS studies. So I would really encourage, if we're talking about restitution and reproduction, even thinking about, the sort of possibilities that digital technology would grant us to, on the reproduction of objects. Most of the objects that we're talking about, for example, also in the context of digital meaning, are not art objects. They are not objects that were made for the museum. And so the sort of grounding for the discussion that we're having here, I don't think applies for the discussion that we are having at the seminar at large, because most of the objects that are being restituted are not museum objects, quite the opposite.
Thank you. I'm reminded that the discussion time is running up, so I leave the last chance to the audience on site. So who will raise the last question? Please.
Thank you for all your presentation. My question back to Laura's idea about how we can count on audience opinion about turning back the objects. Actually, I want to know how museum institution can count on this, count on the result which they can get from their audiences, if there are many audiences who believe that objects should return to the origin. So are the museum institution ready for that? Or is there any strategy or maybe landscapes or even a small, in a small scale, you know, experience that could you know, could help the institution to think about it, how it can be, you know, planned for that, or maybe in future, because it's very, you know, it's very, as you said, it's very tricky to think about that, how we can count on, you know, visitors' opinion, because already we know that publics are, you know, publics are in the favor of returning object to the original, you know, to the actually to home of the object or homeland.
Yeah. I think we discussed a little bit about it. It's a when we talk about restitution, there's a sentiment in people's, like a societal sentiment, but also it's a national sentiment, and also the public has different opinions, but as an institution, how museums can facilitate those sentiments, because some of the museums are run by governments, they are not at liberty to do anything, but like National Trust, you can, in a smaller level, that you can do things. And do you have any examples and suggestions for the smaller, smaller institutions to not really bound to the national legislation or something? So that's our question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Laura?
Well, I know you said my name, but I actually wonder if Anne and Heidi might want to jump in here, since I think that second part of the question is very relevant to you two. But I will just say to the first part of the question, thank you for both of them. I think it's what my case study highlighted is a long process, like one that stretches out over many months and even years, as a way to prepare the museum for taking the object and returning it back to the source community. And in the case of the Kelvin Grove and the Ghost Dance Church, there was this extended process really allowed for this building of community. And I know that's something that you talked a lot about in your presentation, Heidi, this beautiful community that grew out of the experience of working together for such a long period of time. And I just wonder if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. Obviously, what I heard from your question was how important it is for exhibitions and the public face of museums to engage with these debates to the public, because so much in the UK of the conversation isn't happening in that public space. It's not on display. It's happening, as you say, Laura, behind the scenes in the kind of networks and relationships that are built up over time, but it's not always visible. And I think we talk a lot in museum studies about the kind of capacity of the museum to be a civic environment and to kind of educate and discipline and create new public and civic subjectivities. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done in the UK in that space. There's very few displays or exhibitions which co-opt and bring the public into this conversation. And I'm thinking, for contrast, and Anne will know this context very well, I was in Hamburg visiting the Maori meeting house Rauru, and they had a really lovely exhibition in the museum there about Benin and the collection of Benin and the return to Benin of the German collections. And so they really created that space for the visitor to engage with and participate in. And I was walking around British museums trying to find trying to do the same, to look at how we were exhibiting these questions. And there's still so much caution and fear and hesitancy, and you really see that reflected in the labels, particularly in our national institutions. Why is the debate around the Elgin Parthenon marbles not a massive part of a big display at the British Museum? It isn't. So I think that's the first space that needs to be attended to. And there are lots and lots of great examples of museum displays that have done that, as you say, in smaller institutions, even in the UK, but certainly in other parts of the world, in North America, in Australia, and New Zealand. And a final comment I suppose I just make, what we see, I think, in the UK is this resistance to the colonial era dominating the entire narrative around these collections. And I think we do have to be careful of that, because as Anne was pointing out, one doesn't want the Benin objects to only be defined in the context of European colonialism, because that oddly recenters colonialism and the power of colonialism at the expense of this incredibly long history of craft and art and politics, which are not defined by the European colonial era. So I think it's about finding that balance where these stories come out and we talk about them very openly, but they don't necessarily have to be the only thing that we talk about.
Okay, thank you.
Just one comment.
Okay, please.
Thank you so much for such a nice presentation. Thanks, Anne and Heidi and Laura. I want to add just one comment. If you want to build a successful case of repatriation, it must be for 4 elements. Like, I agree with Laura for listening, but first they have the country of origin. They are well experienced to build the claim of any object. So build the claim with experience and listening, and also international cooperation. And the 4th element, it's for the dangers of public awareness of dangers of legal trafficking of cultural goods. If these 4 elements, I think you will succeed your case. Thank you.
Thank you. So
I would love to respond to this very quickly, because I think there is a step before making the claim, which I think is exactly what we're trying to build in Digital Benin, which is a database that connects museum collections, which would allow the communities to find the objects that then they could make a claim for. So I'm really advocating for building that digital database in collaboration with the museums, and with the sort of Digital Benin model that we've shown here, and in collaboration with the source community and for the source communities.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi, Laura, and Anne, and thanks for all coming here. And this is the ending for this session and the panel. Thank you.
我们下午的分享马上开始，请大家就座并把手机调成静音。The